A generational superstar, a championship contender, and a season that was somehow characterized by controversy. It was anticipated that Caitlin Clark would return Indiana to the top in 2026. Instead, heated arguments with coaches, a startling bench moment in Portland, and choices that left fans wondering what was going on behind the scenes were all captured on tape. Clark and the coaching staff were involved in a number of events that continued coming to light until aggressive coaching began to take on a different appearance. Then followed the scandal around rest days, communication breakdowns, and a national pundit who questioned Clark's ability to trust anyone still working for the company. A tense beginning to the season. No one in the Fever organization wanted it to start this way. Caitlin Clark carried the burden of a redemption story into the 2026 season. Draft for the WNBA. Caitlin Clark, University of Iowa, is chosen by the Indiana Fever. A roster rebuilt around her, an injury that ended the previous season, and championship expectations unrelated to patience. The record was tied after 4 games, and the basketball itself was already being overshadowed by something very different. A botched defensive move, an angry exchange of words on the bench, and a camera angle that captured enough to spark 1,000 internet discussions. When Clark got into a heated argument with assistant coach Brianne January, a coach with a defensive background that most players would kill for, the first genuine spark appeared early. A 7-time all-defensive selection with unquestionable qualifications. That ought to have put an end to the discussion before it began. Rather, it introduced an additional layer. Because what was the problem if it wasn't a lack of coaching credibility? Was this just the typical conflict between a demanding player and a demanding coach? The kind of activity that takes place during film sessions and practice gyms at every level of competitive sports? Or did it highlight something more unsettling about the way a star-turned-generational newcomer was assimilated into a system that had a well-established hierarchy long before she came? A second moment quickly ensued. Assistant coach of the Indiana Fever and, more significantly, ASU Hall of Famer Brianne January. On paper, the Fever's 89-78 victory over Seattle that evening appeared to be precisely the kind of performance a team built a season on 21 points. 7 rebounds and 10 assists in a small amount of time. However, the box score was not the headline. It was a courtside video of Clark getting into a furious argument with a Fever assistant, then getting up and moving to a different location on the bench. According to several accounts, the quarrel appeared to stem from the fact that defense had been a problem that night. However, in this league, optics are more important than in virtually any other, and it was hard to overlook the optics here. In front of unblinking cameras, a celebrity who was clearly distraught chose to isolate herself from her own coaching staff. 10 is being the best player you can be in this league, and 1 is still trying to find your feet. Why does a moment like that happen so quickly? Because it validates what some fans have assumed since Clark's arrival, that she is subject to different standards and scrutiny than nearly everyone else on the roster. There is a freeze frame for each gesture. There is a caption for each grimace. And no matter how many victories come after, once that lens is in place, it is difficult to remove. The accumulation of occurrences rather than a single explosive moment made this section especially challenging to read. By the next possession, one clip may be written off as a flash of the game's heat. However, 2 incidences involving separate coaching staff members within the same week begin to resemble a pattern more than a coincidence. And in the first few weeks of the season, fans, pundits, and competing broadcasters started basing whole portions on a pattern. Think about what it really takes for something like the Seattle bench exchange to become a national conversation starter. The A-team had just triumphed. The box score was high, by nearly all conventional measures. And it appears that the whistling was deliberate. A road victory, a few post-game highlights, and a swift transition to the next opponent should have made for a calm, unremarkable evening. Rather, within hours, a single courtside video surpassed the game's actual outcome. That in and of itself provides insight into the story's place in the larger sports world. Few athletes in any league, men's or women's, get as much attention for such a little moment. Every motion becomes proof. Every response turns into a vote. It also poses a legitimate question that merits some thought. Is that examination warranted because the organization is experiencing something truly troubling? Or is that just the inevitable price of being the most prominent player in the history of the sport right now? Most likely both, though in varying amounts based on the person you question. The league's retail sales, attendance, and television numbers have all changed as a result of Clark's ascent. There, Boston came very close to losing their Mitchell. Furthermore, that type of visibility cuts both ways. Few past regimes in this league have ever had to deal with the type of pressure it puts on the coaching staff, and it creates an audience eager to learn every detail of her season. Whatever annoyance appeared on that Seattle bench, it wasn't an isolated incident. It took place under lights that were brighter than nearly any player in the history of the sport has ever had to play under, and that was only the start. Everything changed that night in Portland. If the Seattle incident sparked curiosity, the Portland defeat elevated them to a major plot point. With one of their worst performances of the season, the Fever traveled to confront the Fire. By the half, they were down by double digits, and by the third quarter, the gap had grown to 25 points. Clark had a terrible game, scoring just 6 points on 1 of 7 shots. First, we are aware of Caitlin Clark's court vision. This pass is lovely. Statistics so much out of her typical range that it was obvious something wasn't right. The moment that would be talked about for days occurred in the second quarter of that game. While Clark was sitting on the bench, cameras captured head coach Stephanie White seemingly calling out a lack of defensive effort. With his hands moving, Clark seemed to be attempting to show a defensive read or a failed rotation in his expressive response. Whatever the reason, White had had enough. Raven Johnson, a rookie, took Clark's place on the bench after she urged her to get up. Clark got up and did not immediately take a seat again. Rather, she continued to stand behind her own head coach, shaking her head in front of all the cameras in the building. Is that evidence of dysfunction? Or evidence of the exact opposite? A coach who isn't scared to hold her star player responsible in real time? For decades, coaching staffs have relied on that premise. Because they are the ones who can absorb it and yet deliver, the stars receive the most coaching. According to such reasoning, Portland's events were not at all dysfunctional. Even for the most well-known player on the team, it was just coaching. This season, he has led the league in assists with 41% shooting and 33% three-point shooting. Shannon, her last 5 games. However, this is where the subtlety becomes intricate. It's not always the same to hold a celebrity accountable and publicly bench her in a blowout in a way that clearly upsets her. One is the philosophy of coaching. A skeptical audience may perceive the other as a message being conveyed. During a halftime broadcast, television experts saw that 2 reputable voices were taking dramatically opposite stances. One tended to support the ruling as basic accountability. The other, who questioned if the situation had been handled with the consideration a franchise cornerstone deserves, appeared to be much more sympathetic to Clark. That divided things. When 2 credible experts with decades of experience view the same 22 seconds of tape and come to different conclusions, it indicates that the moment was actually unclear. She drained deep 3 after deep 3 during a 38-second stretch. It's not a clear-cut example of victim or criminal. Rather, it depends solely on the viewer's preconceived notions. In the attention economy of contemporary sports media, ambiguity seldom remains contained. It is examined frame by frame until a 60-second basketball game serves as a test of a coaching concept. Another angle seldom appears in the loudest takes. The rookie who took Clark's spot on the bench, Raven Johnson, did not seek to be at the center of a scandal. After a choice that had little to do with her own performance, she was just the next player up. However, every discussion of that substitution focused on what it meant for Clark rather than what it meant for a rookie who was abruptly pushed into a moment of intense scrutiny. It's equally important to consider what the alternative might have been. Clark is a skilled floater, attacker, and catcher. Would there have been less uproar or just a different type if White had remained silent and ignored the lap? Opponents who think elite athletes should receive unwavering support may have agreed. Opponents who think that everyone should be held accountable would have discovered a whole new cause for alarm. There might not have been a version of that sequence that completely avoided criticism, which says more about the unavoidable scrutiny that now surrounds almost every choice involving Indiana's franchise player than it does about Stephanie White's coaching philosophy. The rest debate exacerbated the situation. Just as the bench trade discussion was about to end, there is a desire to succeed. And a hunger. However, doing it at home with the people you love and want to fight with every day has a really peaceful and composed quality. The group gave its detractors a fresh challenge. Shortly before tip-off, word leaked out that Clark would not be playing against the Portland Fire at home. The justification was a season-long strategic management plan, which, by itself, may have been acceptable in practically any other situation. Minutes are managed by teams. Health is managed by teams. It frequently goes unnoticed by the public and occurs in every professional league. However, it was nearly difficult to disentangle the timing from all that had just transpired. Everyone is aware of who should have it. When magic occurs, magic occurs. This was no typical mid-season maintenance day. This followed several obvious arguments with the coaching staff. Fans responded quickly and harshly. Some criticized the timing, publicly questioning whether strategic management was only a more agreeable term for anything related to the previous conflict rather than a true physical necessity. Others concentrated on the supporters who were irritated by the delayed announcement and had traveled for hours to see her play. The notion that the league's biggest attraction would miss a home game so early in a season that was supposed to be about redemption was ridiculed by a few responses that veered toward downright derision. In response to the rumors, Coach White made it clear that Clark was in good health and that the club wasn't dealing with any specific issues. There was no hedging, no confusing language. It was an unequivocal denial. However, if a fan base is primed to perceive tension in every choice involving its star player, denials seldom go as quickly or far as suspicion. Should the company have taken greater action to anticipate the situation? Perhaps. Given that this is, by most accounts, our first Fever game, should supporters have given the crew the benefit of the doubt? The first game of Fever. We were looking at other tickets. Created a roster that was competitive. Additionally, the reality may be an unpleasant combination of a legitimate need to manage a player who has a history of significant injuries and a fan base that had already lost faith in the management's communication. It wasn't necessarily malicious intent that this occasion revealed. It revealed a communication gap, which is the discrepancy between an organization's internal knowledge and what it chooses, or is unable to, explain to external observers. That discrepancy has the potential to harm one's reputation more than the initial choice in a time when every roster selection is examined in real time. The Fever's treatment of Clark's health has already drawn criticism. The team received a formal warning earlier in the season for improperly informing the league of her availability before to a game. Austin advised Mitchell to ease down and finish the task, which was on top of a stressful few weeks previously. ADT contributed to the developing perception that the franchise's communication about its most valuable asset fell short of the level of attention she received. For portions of the season, Clark's back problem persisted. He was listed as probable, questionable, and then likely again on the injury report, but there was never a definitive update that fans could rely on. In a medical sense, none of that suggests poor management. Because hurrying a player back involves significantly greater long-term danger, organizations frequently err on the side of conservative timetables when managing soft tissue and spinal injuries. However, caution and clarity are not synonymous. And a company may be acting in a medically sound manner, but it may not be communicating this in a way that maintains confidence. Even when the underlying decision-making is good, fans become frustrated when updates are delayed or changed after they have already made travel arrangements. And it was this frustration, rather than the rest day itself, that propelled this tale into the subsequent chapter. Good first game. Step aside, Clark, if you want to shake Vandersloot. The tale that transcended basketball. It didn't take long for the discussion to spread beyond fans and into the larger media environment, where viewpoints are typically far less measured and louder. One notable instance was when a national sports pundit questioned Clark's ability to trust anyone within the organization, not just the coaching staff. Not at all. This perspective held that, whether on purpose or as a result of organizational instability, even the general manager, the team president, and Clark's own attorney were working against her best interests. The recommended course of action was an urgent trade request, presented as the only practical way to proceed, rather than patience or communication. This type of analysis begs the obvious question. Does it provide a true understanding of what goes on in Indianapolis behind closed doors? Her threes are at 26 feet, and she enters at seconds. Or is it the loudest viewpoint intended to draw attention in a crowded sports media environment? There is a huge temptation to depict every dispute as a five-alarm calamity since the sports commentary market favors certainty considerably more than subtlety. However, pundits with reliable sources in front offices and locker rooms do occasionally bring up information that turns out to be true long before it is made public. Rather than a single outlier seeking clicks, it is more difficult to ignore the larger pattern of issues posed by several independent voices. There isn't a constructed narrative when reputable broadcasters debate on live television over how a bench moment should be perceived, a seasoned analyst makes a trade demand, and a fan base reacts to a rest day announcement with genuine fear. That's numerous independent strands converging on the same uncomfortable question whether the people responsible for creating the league's most marketable talent become fixated on the task. And you enter the game, where you become competitive due to your obsession with the amount of time you've invested, are acting in a way that will benefit her in the long run as a rival and as the focal point of the franchise's business prospects. Additionally, there is a more subdued aspect that merits consideration. The notion that coaches are, almost as a matter of professional duty, particularly severe on their most gifted players. Stars who are able to take criticism without losing their performance are given more of it. Even publicly, Briann January's defensive resume was used as justification for Clark to just listen instead of resisting. However, the question that supporters continued to pose is not entirely addressed by that argument. Uncertain trust and strict coaching are not incompatible. It is possible for an organization to demand perfection from its star while failing to communicate in a way that prevents doubt from ever arising. It's important to keep in mind that this conjecture wasn't born. An exceptionally strong correlation between Clark's personal success and the league's overall financial situation has characterized her career. 10 league changes, 7 ties, the way, Clark. Every time she hits the stage, television ratings rise, and arena attendance changes based on whether she is selected or not. This financial reality raises concerns about Carrie Waite's coaching, protection, and communication methods that go well beyond the locker room of a single squad. When pundits voice concerns about the organization's internal trust, they are appealing to a wider concern about whether the league's most significant player's infrastructure has kept up with her significance. It also explains why ideas on this subject seldom remain composed for very long. Outside of a local market, a coaching staff working with an average player would hardly register. For better or worse, a coaching staff dealing with a player credited with changing the commercial course of an entire league receives distinct attention. Although that discrepancy is unfair, it is a fact of reporting Caitlin Clark's career, and it was this reality that paved the way for everything that followed. The story doesn't end with victory. This is the element of the story that adds complexity to all narratives centered on dysfunction and crises. The basketball itself has been improving steadily and dramatically. Following that difficult period in late May, Indiana managed to put together a multi-game winning streak based on Clark's playmaking, going back to the level that made her a national celebrity the first place. She has been rising to the top of all-time leaderboards and setting franchise records. Loves and supports women's basketball, and they are aware of current events. They are aware of when to applaud. Posting the kind of box scores that won her the title of Conference Player of the Week. The group moved up the rankings. In retrospect, the losses that caused so much of the initial worry began to appear more like a difficult period than a long-term issue. Does that indicate that the issues brought up earlier in the season just vanish? Not totally, and that's something to linger with instead of hurrying by. Winning has the power to muffle outside noise without necessarily addressing its root cause. Friction between a star player and a coaching staff can undoubtedly be resolved through time and performance, but a turnaround does not imply that the underlying dynamics have been totally resolved behind closed doors or that the friction was never there. Because winning reduces everyone's motivation to exacerbate the discomfort, many successful partnerships in professional sports carry unresolved tension far into a championship run. Going forward, it doesn't really matter whether another video of a contentious sideline interaction appears. Regardless of how well things are going, such things happen to every team in this league every season. Whether the communication gap that characterized the rest day debate improves is what counts. Whether the organization's internal events are reflected in the public perception. Have faith. Box scores alone are insufficient to recreate a once-shaken fan base this size and level of engagement. Rather than merely when things are going well, it rebuilds through consistency, transparency, and the cumulative evidence of a relationship that endures under duress. Is Caitlin Clark being mistreated by the Indiana Fever coaching staff, or are they just treating her the same way that all top athletes are eventually treated? The truth is that no one outside of that locker room knows for sure, and anyone who asserts complete confidence in either direction is merely promoting a story rather than providing information. What can be confidently said? Was there genuine tension in the early season, as evidenced by several occurrences rather than just one? The organization's communication with those who are most invested in its franchise player is seriously lacking, as evidenced by the response. The issue that still looms over Indianapolis, despite the mounting wins, is whether that gap closes permanently or just goes silent until the next challenging part of the season. There is a version of this story in which the winning streak serves as the whole resolution. The early tension is eliminated by the box scores, and no one bothers to ask the more difficult issues again until something compels them to. That would be the simple conclusion. It would also be the unfinished one. Clark is currently playing some of the best basketball of her career thanks to the same coaching staff that benched her in Portland. The same team that mishandled a rest day's communication is now on a 4-game winning streak, with its franchise players breaking records in the process. Pretending otherwise, either by completely disregarding the early tension or by refusing to accept the subsequent improvement, would only convey half the story because both of those things are true at the same time. In the coming weeks, fans, commentators, and the team itself will probably be keeping an eye out for anything other than another widely shared bench clip. Whether post-game explanations continue to match what's visible on the court, whether health updates arrive with enough clarity to prevent another round of suspicion, and whether the next disagreement, if and when one occurs, is handled with a kind of transparency that was lacking the first time around are all more subdued and possibly more significant. Patience is purchased with victory. It doesn't buy trust by default. These are obtained in completely different ways, and Indiana's coaching staff seems to recognize that differentiation is still being tested in real time. This is where it leaves us. The same coaching staff that benched Portland's franchise player is the one whose system is currently breaking records. Alongside a 4-game victory streak that no one anticipated in May, there was a communication breakdown that led to weeks of distrust. Pretending otherwise would only tell half of the tale because both of these things are true. The true question is whether trust is restored prior to the next storm, not if another video goes viral. Click the like button immediately if this made you think. Please let me know if Indiana is treating this appropriately. This is not the end of the narrative, so subscribe.